On this very day, 100 years ago, the body of one of the most important medical figures of the previous century was found in the sea just off the coast of the Isle of Man. I'm Dave Moore, and in this episode of Island Life, we'll find out about the extraordinary life of Doctor James Niven. Plus, later in the programme, another landmark as the Manx Bible celebrates its 250th anniversary. We'll hear from expert Dr. Tim Grass. But first, on September the 30th, 1925, the body of Dr. James Niven was found in the sea just off Onken Head. On the shore was his jacket containing a note which told of his decision to take his own life. He wasn't a resident of the Isle of Man. In fact, he was visiting the island at the time of his death. His, though, is an incredible story, and the nature in which it ended is particularly sad considering the huge number of lives he saved, in particular during the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918. During that time, he was Manchester's medical officer, and Niven became well known across the British Isles for his call to close down society as much as possible to stop the spread of the disease, a situation familiar to many of us during the recent lockdown periods to prevent COVID-19 taking a stronger hold than it did. He ensured all schools in Manchester were closed, a measure which historians say saved many, many lives. Dr. Niven also warned people to avoid public gatherings, insisting that flu sufferers should be kept warm in a ventilated room, and advised that sick people shouldn't return to work except under medical advice. Ultimately, the Spanish flu pandemic killed more than 200,000 people in the UK, which is around a quarter of the number of British soldiers who were killed during the First World War. Globally, the disease killed 50 million people. The influenza outbreak began in 1918 and became known as Spanish flu because newspapers in Spain were among the few able to report the pandemic's effects. Elsewhere, wartime censors in Britain, France and the United States had minimised reports of the illness and associated deaths. Unlike in the recent coronavirus pandemic, there was no nationwide lockdown. However, widespread staff shortages due to people falling sick meant that everyday life was severely hampered. Buses and trains were cancelled, mines that provided the country's essential coal closed, and thousands of police officers failed to turn up for work. The flu was fast, killing entire families just hours or days after they displayed symptoms, with a high mortality rate in the young, aged 5 and under, those between 20 and 40, and those over 65. Patients would struggle to breathe as fluid filled their lungs, and due to being starved of oxygen, their bodies would begin to turn blue around the face, lips, ears, fingers and toes. Although there were no laws about social distancing, there was still general advice which warned about how Spanish flu was highly contagious. A newspaper report read,
"The first and obvious measure is to avoid infection as far as possible. If the person could isolate himself on top of a mountain, he would certainly escape. If he travels daily in crowded trains and omnibuses and mingles with crowds under cover, he will almost surely fall a victim sooner or later."
It also warned that the virus was present in the nose and upper part of the air passages, adding that when a sufferer coughs or sneezes, he spreads infection. The report continued.
"The danger of catching the disease in the open is not very great, but crowded streets like the Strand and Cheapside in London are little better than theatres and churches."
It concluded by saying that a man who walks 2 to 3 miles to work will defy the microbe, but if he travelled in a stuffy train or omnibus, the virus would have the better of him. Dr. Niven had taken on his role as Medical Officer of Health for Manchester in 1894 and had been in the post for nearly 25 years by the time the flu outbreak began. As the pandemic gained pace, he quickly became the most vocal proponent of measures to curb the spread. He issued a 6-point public notice that warned Mancunians of the measures they should take. He insisted the sick should be separated from the healthy, that those with symptoms should at once seek medical help, and that those attacked should not join assemblages of people for at least 10 days. His notice added that special attention should be paid to cleanliness and ventilation, and that discharges from nose and mouth should not be allowed to get dry on pocket handkerchiefs. After the pandemic had waned, Dr. Niven co-authored the first report that looked into the impact of the pandemic. The report said,
To what cause is the disease attributable? That is a problem which still remains unsolved. The final solution, when achieved, will be one of the greatest events in medical history.
It then added,
One thing that remains to be reasonably certain, and that is, Until a universal improvement and the standard of comfort and the conditions of life is secured, there will be no prospect of effectively mitigating this deadly complaint.
Niven went on to argue that social distancing and good hand hygiene can help to stop the spread of the virus. His measures didn't stop at influenza pandemics, however. The doctor was known for his work on raising awareness of preventative measures against tuberculosis, as well as campaigns against smoke pollution and the house fly. He also warned of the threat posed by unwashed beer glasses in pubs. He said,
"It has been found over and over again that many licensees of public houses are in the habit of serving drink to customer after customer in glasses or pots without any pretense of cleaning."
His public health measures were responsible for bringing the death rate in Manchester to the lowest on record at 13.57 per 1,000. Despite helping to dramatically cut his own city's death rate through his public health measures, the medic was himself hit by tragedy in 1921 when his wife passed away. This was after Dr. Niven had contracted Spanish flu himself, but recovered. 2 years later, he was hit by further family turmoil when his brother died. During this time, he was quoted as being very low physically and mentally. 4 years after his wife's death, the grief had become too much to bear, and Dr. Niven, who was then aged 74, took his own life. In September 1925, he boarded a ferry to the Isle of Man. He declared to the manager of the hotel he stayed in that he would leave the island by steamer. The next morning, it became clear that his bed had not been slept in. His body was found the next day. Dr. Niven's belongings were inspected, and he left behind a note reading,
"In case of my death, this letter will be left in my coat by the shore. My name is on the handbag in my bedroom and the address of my residence. The bag is to be sent to Miss Cheeseman of Granville Street, Fallowfield, Manchester. I desire to be buried at the sea near Douglas."
He is believed to have used the deadly chemical hydrogen cyanide to kill himself. The tributes poured in from multiple sources. Dr. Matthew Hay, medical officer for Aberdeen, remarked that Niven was one of the ablest and most strenuous British officers of health, who did better and more trustworthy work than all other contemporary medical officers. A newspaper report, under the headline "Doctor Found Dead," read as follows.
Dr. James Niven, late medical officer for Health Manchester, was found drowned in a creek on the north side of Douglas Bay, Isle of Man, yesterday. A coat seen on the beach contained a letter stating in the event of his death, the writer wished his body to be buried at sea. After 3 hours' search, the body of Dr. James Niven was recovered in about 10 feet of water. Dr. Niven arrived at Douglas on Monday.
It's understood Dr. Niven was survived by a daughter. A tragic end to the life, exactly 100 years ago today, of someone who undoubtedly had saved the lives of so many others. You're listening to Ireland Life on Manx Radio. This year is the 250th anniversary of the publication of the first Manx Bible. And to celebrate this milestone, a conference is being held this weekend at the Manx Museum in Douglas. Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and visiting scholar at Queen's University Belfast, Dr. Tim Grass, will be speaking at the event, who joins me now. And if I can ask you first of all, Tim, where does the story of the Manx Bible begin?
The story begins some while earlier than 1775, which is the anniversary we're celebrating this year. It starts with the impact of Protestant reform throughout Britain and including the Isle of Man. Until 1610, however, no part of the Bible existed in written translation in Manx. That year, Bishop John Phillips, who was a Welshman, the third of three successive Welsh bishops at that time on the island, he had a translation made of the Book of Common Prayer, which is the authorised liturgy of the Church of England. And he included in that a translation of the readings that were set for each Sunday in the church's year. That was the first time any part of the Manx Bible had been translated. Now, Phillips hoped to get this printed. However, there was resistance to his proposal, and in the end, the translation only circulated in manuscript. We think, although we're not certain, that a copy was made for each of the 17 parish churches on the island. One of those translations has survived and is in the Manx Museum. It'll be quite possibly on display during the conference, in fact. Now, that translation dropped out of use after a few decades, partly because the impact of the English Civil War on the island and the upset which that caused in church circles as well as every other circle. By the time Bishop Wilson arrived in 1697, there was, in effect, nothing that he could use. What happened was that clergy would work from the English Book of Common Prayer and the English Bible. They translate it as they went along during the service. Of course, that led to all sorts of problems because some clergy were better translators from English than others. It was therefore Bishop Wilson's aim to get a translation produced of the four Gospels and the Book of Acts. And the project seems to have had its genesis in 1722 in a cell in Castle Rushen at the time when he and one of his senior officials, the Vicar General William Walker, were imprisoned as part of a contretemps with the then governor. We know that all four of the Gospels and Acts were translated, but only Matthew was ever published. That was published on its own in 1748. None of the other books ever appeared. I'm not sure. I don't think the translation that was made at that time, which was mostly the work of William Walker, actually has survived. So when Wilson died in 1755 and his successor Hildesley became bishop, one of Hildesley's priorities was to provide a liturgy, a form of service, and a Bible for the use of the Manx Church. You've got to remember that this was a time when the British Empire, I suppose you'd say at that point already, was beginning to expand. You had great interest in church circles in what was being done to provide for those who are now becoming British subjects in the Americas. Bishop Wilson, some folk might remember, wrote a book which ended up being reprinted as an instruction for the Indians. I remember seeing a copy of that on display in America some years ago. It was a bit of a weird feeling. Anyway, the thought was, well, we're doing all this work for all these people in far-flung parts of British dominions. Why is nothing happening for the Manx Church, which is one of the oldest parts of the Church of England? And this was the drum that Bishop Hildesley decided to bang. He did so extremely effectively. He also engaged in plenty of fundraising, although it has to be said that pretty much all the funds he raised came from off island because there were very few people on island who really could afford to sub this to any great extent. Hildesley then got his clergy together. They divvied up the various books of the Bible between them, translating them. The translations varied in quality, but what happened was that Philip Moore, who was then ministering at St. Matthew's, and a young guy called John Kelly took the translations, harmonized them, checked them against the original languages, Hebrew and Greek, made sure that latest scholarly findings were reflected in the translations that were produced, and so on. So then the translation was published bit by bit. We had 3 volumes making up the Manx Bible, the third appearing in 1775, which was the date when the whole Bible was also finally published.
Of course, Manx was the native language of the Isle of Man, I suppose, at the time. But what were Bibles then? Were they in English? Were they in Latin? You did say It took a long time for the Manx Bible to be published. How was the Bible read back then?
Christianity arrived on the island well before the Manx language did, as it happens, 5th or 6th century.
Despite Norse rule, etc., we had Viking rule around 1200, etc.
Before that. Yeah. To be honest, it's not quite in the mists of time, because stories have come down about how significant saints like St. German and St. Mahud played key roles in the introduction of Christianity to the island. It seems to be likely, although I'm not a specialist in this period, that it came from the direction of Ireland and Scotland as much as anywhere. The Isle of Man was part of the whole Celtic world. Now, as far as the Bible's concerned, the possession of written Bibles is very much, it became much more widespread late medieval times and after. In mainland Europe, from the 14th century, you had the Renaissance, and part of that was going back to the original languages, going back to the original sources, and this worked in all academic disciplines, but that included how we understand the Christian faith. And so for the original sources, let's go back, they were saying, to the Bible. And so you had the beginnings of a movement to have the Bible translated into various local languages. Such translations had existed, but there was much more of an impetus to get this done and to provide it for languages which up to that point hadn't had translations. So on the Isle of Man, such Bibles as existed would have been probably in Latin until the Protestant Reformation began to have an impact, because of course one of the great things it did in England was to stimulate the production of English Bible translations. And in fact, next year marks the 500th anniversary of William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, which had a massive impact on the development of the English language. And there are phrases that we still use today which actually originated with Tyndale. So you had then English Bibles coming in from, some point in the 16th century onwards, although the Isle of Man was slow to adopt Protestant reform. It was several decades behind England, really. So at the point where Bishop Phillips begins his translation work, the Bibles in the churches used by clergy would have been in English. But of course, you've got to remember that Phillips was a Welshman, and Wales had seen a move to have the Bible translated into Welsh, which Phillips would have been well aware of. So I guess it's not being too imaginative to say that he was thinking, well, we had it translated into Welsh, shouldn't the same be done for Manx?
When did Christianity become the main religion in the island? When did it take hold?
Well, it was taking hold from the very early period. The Diocese of Sodor-Aman has traditionally dated its founding to the year 447.
But as I say, we did have the Vikings coming along with their own religious beliefs, etc. So
we did, and the pendulum swung back a bit at that point. But then, of course, the Vikings gradually began to adopt the Christian faith. You can see on some of the crosses, the combination of Christian imagery and Viking imagery. I'm not an expert on that period, and I can't really say too much, but that's just a flying overview, really.
But the island did have a bishop, I think, from something like the 5th, 6th century.
Well, that's the point, yes. It's reckoned to have had a bishop. Certainly from very on, though it's difficult to find much by way of references in early writings. We don't have as much by way of sources as we would have, say, for England or indeed for Wales. But then I suppose the diocese in its, what should we say, fixed form appears to have been created, I think, in the 12th century, though, I want to be very careful how I phrase this, because someone who knows the period better than me might say I'm nuancing it wrong. And at that point, it was under the Archbishop of Trondheim in Norway, and the Isle of Man formed one diocese with what we now know as the Outer Hebrides. So it's the Diocese of Man and the Isles. Those two parts separated in the 14th century. There's all sorts of complicated reasons for that. Thereafter, the diocese comprised just the Isle of Man. So, and of course, you can parallel that with political developments.
So when the first Manx Bible was issued in 1775, how long then did that exist for? Because obviously the Manx language didn't quite become extinct, but almost became extinct.
Well, it's still there. It still exists. in the sense that people still have copies, it is still used, it is still studied. Oddly enough, somebody gave me a copy the other week.
Am I right in thinking that even up until the 1970s it was being reprinted?
Yes, you are. A copy was reprinted to celebrate the millennium of Tynwald in 1979. It was printed from the printing of 1819, which was the most widely used printing of the Manx Bible, which has slight differences, but not many, from 1775. The 1775 one was just the whole Bible was produced for clergy use. Lay people had, they could, if they could afford them, buy the separate volumes, the 3 volumes, but the clergy had the 1-volume edition for use in church. It's a big, heavy book that would sit, on a lectern, a reading desk in the church. And the first popular, if you like, printing of the whole Bible was the one done in 1819.
We have around, I think, 3,000 people in the Isle of Man that can claim that they speak Manx. So keeping the Manx Bible going, in the sense that it continues to exist and its need for it to exist, or is it just an historical timepiece?
Does it have any contemporary use? Well, it's as relevant, I would suggest, as the Manx language, and it is seen as well worthwhile continuing the use of the Manx language. We have a Manx medium primary school, of course, and an extensive network of Manx classes and other groups studying the Manx language. And the significance of the Bible in terms of the development of the Manx language is such that it is still used as a language text today by reading groups, who are studying it like they might study any other piece of Manx literature. The thing I think we have to remember is that the first book wasn't printed in Manx until 1707. Manx, before that point, existed as an oral language. So when the Bible did begin to appear, there wasn't much else that had been printed in Manx. And so the Bible was that much more significant because of it. It had the field much more to itself.
And to bring things right up to date, it's just gone digital, I believe, earlier this year.
Yeah, there was an edition put online about 20 years ago, which is still available, but it was felt that it would be good to update this. And so early this year, the Bible Society, who are based in Swindon, but have international reach, put the Manx Bible online as a project, part of a project to put online Bibles in all the Celtic languages. So you have got the text of the 1775 Bible, you've got the text of the 1819 reprint, you've got the text of some of the earlier parts of the Bible which had been published, and so on. And this is freely accessible on, I think it's called the Global Bible website. One of the speakers at the conference will be talking about how the Bible Society set about producing an online edition of the Manx Bible.
That's my next question. So this weekend, you're holding a conference at the Manx Museum in Douglas to celebrate this 250th milestone. What exactly will be happening?
Well, we've got the usual array of conference speakers, various levels. Some of it, like my talk, is very much sort of introductory, telling the story. Others are quite technical, looking at the language that's used in particular parts of the Manx Bible. You've got a session on the link between St Matthew's and the Manx Bible, not only Philip Moore's role, but how the Bible was used, because St Matthew's in the early 19th century was famous for the Manx language services which were held there. And also we have, during the lunch break, the opportunity to visit the display of manuscripts and printed items relating to the Manx Bible in the Manx National Heritage Library in the museum. And Wendy Thurkettle, the archivist, will be there to talk about those. This is something which will be open to the public all through the day, in fact. But those of us who are in the conference will have the opportunity to have a look at that during the lunch break. everybody's welcome to the conference. You can come for all of the day or just drop in for part of it. It begins with refreshments from 9:45 and closes at 4:15 with a lunch break between 12:30 and 2:15. So free to attend, everybody's welcome, and look forward to meeting folk there.
My thanks to Dr. Tim Grass. So a reminder, the Manx Bible at 250 takes place this Saturday at the Eye Museum next to the Manx Museum on Kingswood Grove in Douglas. Rare Manx Bible editions and manuscripts will be on display in the Manx National Heritage Library. Along with Dr. Grass, there are contributions from Mike Hoy, Christopher Lewin, Rob Tier, Paul Lewin, Neil Rees, amongst others. During lunch, archivist Wendy Thurkettle will introduce manuscripts and prints which tell the story of the Manx Bible. The event gets underway at 10 o'clock in the morning and will conclude by 4:15 that afternoon. You can listen back to this edition of Island Life online by going to manxradio.com, where there is a broad selection of programmes with Manx themes to keep you entertained, or by subscribing to Manx Radio podcasts using your usual podcast provider. My thanks again to Dr. Tim Grass ahead of this weekend's conference, and my thanks also to Beth Espy, Lewis Foster and Christian Jones for their assistance in remembering the legacy of Dr. James Niven on the 100th anniversary of his passing.